I tried to work with boards, tried to work with schools to talk about you can be diverse and not change standards. There's something about our history, not something that sounds like it's mysterious, but our history has made it seem like if you have kids of color, Black kids, Latino kids, some mixed kids, then you're lowering your standards. And it's just so not true. There's a bigger picture. And if you are educating boards as to what the full picture looks like, then you know that you can have an inclusive community with all kids who are bringing so much to the table. But if we keep admissions with one or two check boxes of what kids have to jump through to get in, then we're keeping the same kids going to private schools.
The big question: how quickly can brands and businesses change and modernize in response to the changing demographics globally? The future of work, demand for modernizing the practice of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and industry corrections. This is why we started the Change Podcast by Reframe, to help people leaders like you get answers that accelerate inclusive change and growth that reflects where the world is going. Get ready as we host a discussion with people leaders faced with the same challenges and modernize their approach to solving a decades-old problem. I'm your host, Jeffrey L. Bowman. Linda and Wendy, welcome to the Change Podcast by Reframe. We're happy to have you and glad you're making the time to join us. This podcast is really about a lot of things that have happened within the world as it relates to schools and kids. And we wanted to take the opportunity to invite a couple guests that specialize in providing access and a pathway for all kids who want to enter schools, private schools. And so we invited School First. And for those who don't know School First, these are the co-presidents of School First. And we really wanted to take an opportunity to talk about change. A lot of is happening in the world as relates to change, specifically within our educational institutions. And so why not invite two experts to talk about the changes happening within schools. And so before we jump in, a lot of times what we do with the Change Podcast is really take everyone through in terms of like, who are you? How did you get here? And what are the things that drew you to this industry? So I would like to first ask if you could introduce yourselves to the audience, and whoever chooses to go first, just talk a bit about, your background, your journey, and how you got into the practice that you are, and provide a little bit of education in terms of who School First is.
I'm Linda Talton. I have been working in education for over 30 years. I started my father started a preschool, actually Trinity Preschool on Wall Street, 35 years ago. I started there, and I have tried to escape education for many years, and I keep coming back. I got into admission because I was a kindergarten teacher at Cathedral School, in Manhattan, St. John the Divine. And as a kindergarten teacher, I had to do assessments. And so that led my interest into admission and how are we choosing these kids and how come these kids are disappearing that I thought were so great. And so that's how I got into the admission world. And I've lived in different cities, San Francisco, worked at 2 schools in San Francisco as director of admission, 1 school here in New York City, and decided that I liked all of the things about admission that were the hand-holding piece, all the hand-holding pieces, not about throwing the events and sort of bragging about my school, but making sure that families had a really good experience while going through the process. And particularly, I was always connecting admission to inclusion work. Right? So that's the fun thing about admission for me is you're building community. Admission is the heartbeat of the school. And, you're just working with teachers and administrators and prospective parents and current parents, prospective students and current students. So my conversations with parents really, no matter where they were from or what walks of life they came from, was really about like creating an inclusive experience for their kids. And and here I am. I started School First 5 years ago.
Okay. Before we jump to that, let's Wendy, how did you get involved in helping families and kids?
Yeah, long time ago as well, over 30 years ago, I started as an intern in kindergarten, and then in 5th grade at the Town School for Boys in San Francisco. And after I received my master's in counseling, I was the school counselor at Menlo School in Atherton during the .com boom. And I found myself in the office with a lot of different kids that weren't fitting in. For whatever reason, they did not feel included on campus. And that wasn't unique to the school I was working at. It was happening in all of our independent schools, be it kids of color, be it kids with diverse socioeconomic backgrounds, be it LGBTQ kids. And here I was, a 25-year-old counselor, thinking, what's going on? Why can't we help kids feel like they belong in this school? We asked them to come.
Yeah.
And yet they're in my office crying. And here's this preppy white girl from Olympia, Washington, thinking, why am I the one that's supposed to figure this out for them? And that led me to start working with the administration to see what can we do, what needs to happen differently so that all kids are included in schools. And that's when I got into admissions. I said, okay, I need to figure out how do we do this so I know we are asking the kids who will thrive in our school and building a more diverse community. We'll get to it later of how that's turned out, because that was 30 years ago and we're still looking for that word change. So we'll talk about that. But I went from being a school counselor to an administrator so I could impact the inclusivity and diversity of the schools. And it worked out.
For folks who are just joining this conversation, what led you both down the path of public versus private? And what are the differences when you talk about public schools versus private schools?
Ooh, that's a good one. For me, I grew up going to private school.
What is private school for those who just really...
Private school is an independent school. The language is interchangeable. I think private people who don't know the independent school world connect more to private school. They get that it's a school that you pay tuition to, and I always say independent means just that. You're meeting the same goals as public schools each year, whether you're in 3rd, 4th, or 5th grade, but you can be more nuanced in the way that you get to those goals. You get to create curriculum you don't have to get permission from the city. You're independent, so also parents have more involvement and more of a voice in independent schools. Class size is much.
Who are the parents that chooses?
Who are the parents?
Profile of parents that typically choose independent, private versus public.
I think it's all over the place. I think it's parents. Yeah, I think it's families who can afford it. Families like me who grew up going to private school who want that same thing for their kids. I think it's parents who have maybe been dismayed by the public school experience that their kids have had and are looking for something different and hear about a thing where maybe my child could have a smaller class size or go to school and be so excited to get there because it's creative. They tend to be more creative environments that don't ask the child to fit in, but they try to sort of meet the child where they are. So that's one thing that's really appealing about independent schools. So they're kind of, I will say, because there are many ways to attend independent school, whether you're paying full price or you have tuition assistance, because of that, they are pretty diverse spaces.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Wendy, is there anything you want to add to it?
I mean, I would say I went into my master's thinking I would be working in public schools. That's what I wanted to do. I was 25 and I thought I didn't want to go serve very wealthy families. I wanted to work with a wider variety and more organic community. And I was in San Francisco, California at the time. And literally the year I graduated is when I actually wanted to work in Oakland, California.
Mhm.
All the school counselors were laid off and they were hiring security instead. And that just broke my heart. And so I took the job that I could get. There were no public school counseling positions. And that's when I got into the independent school world. And then having kids, I've
That
had kids
changes
in both
everything,
public
right?
and private. It changes everything, but I've had kids. I've left private school to go to public school with my son, and he had better experience. So it's really about the individual and what school district you're in, and where do you have access, and what does your child need.
Mm-hmm.
So for some, it could be
Yeah.
the neighborhood school, and for a lot, especially post pandemic, what independent schools can do for individual kids
Yeah.
isn't it's not equitable for all kids. Unfortunately, there's only 10% of our country goes to independent schools, but what they can offer is unique.
Last question before we jump into a little bit more about School First. So, as you know, this podcast is about change. And so when did independent schools or private schools, for again, a little brief history snapshot for the folks that are kind of new to this conversation, when did it change in terms of public versus private or private versus public? Like what's kind of a little tidbit of history in terms of how the schools come into fruition?
When did private schools come into fruition? They've always been an option for wealthy families.
Wealthy
Yeah.
families.
Wealthy white families.
Yeah,
Wealthy white families.
and actually, public schools were actually started by former enslaved people who decided that they wanted to give their kids an education that they had been denied, and literally right after slavery, they started popping up. These churches started popping up with these schoolhouses, and that's really how public school came to be.
Outstanding.
Public. So I'm trying, because I was going through a totally different direction. So I want to make sure we're coming together too. But both is true, right? I mean, private schools were founded to feed Harvard and Yale by wealthy white families to be excluded. And then they started popping up more when segregation ended and people were forcing kids. And then a lot of white people were saying, oh no, we're going to the private schools that were they were created to be exclusive.
Yeah.
Exclusively for the rich and white. I would say about 30 years ago, when people started realizing that 20 to 30 years ago, that we're smarter when we're all together, when we're learning from each other. And there's a diverse perspective in each classroom. But that has been a slow change. But yeah, I mean, I think small houses, I'm trying to combine, Linda, what you were saying. Certain populations had to build their own because there wasn't education available.
There was none. There was zero. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And it's funny because we have this conversation all the time, and we go to these conferences, particularly POCC, People of Color Conference, which is a conference that's put on by the National Association of Independent Schools every year. And it was started, 35 years ago. To create a space for people of color who work in independent schools to come together and, learn about how they how to stay in these spaces that they didn't really feel comfortable in. It was really kind of cathartic space that was created for people of color. And so we talk all the time about how we've been forcing ourselves into these institutions as people of color because they really were built to get away from us, not to include us. So
the exclusive mechanism. So
yeah,
how did School First start, and how did you guys meet, and when did you guys decide to come together and start School First?
Okay. Well, Wendy and I have known each other since we lived in the Bay Area together. I worked at San Francisco Day, and she was at San Francisco School, I think.
School, yeah.
And we were both directors of admission, and I needed her because I was new to the area and she had children and I had a child and I needed people. So somebody introduced Wendy and I, and we've been friends ever since. And I feel like that was probably like 16 or 17 years ago. And we always have had the same lens when it comes to admission and building community. So it was really organic and it felt really right when Wendy approached me a year and a half or so ago, almost 2 years ago now, and asked if she could join School First. And I was excited. And she's only served to grow the energy around School First. So I'm so excited to have had her join me.
And what exactly is School First?
School First is an admission consulting placement firm. So we help families to navigate the admission process. And we work with many cities around the country. I feel like in the next couple of years, we'll probably say that we work with every city in the country.
It gets back to your hand holding.
Right, exactly. And it's the fun part. We love having the meetings with the families and creating school lists and helping them with their applications and then helping them with the decisions finally in the end of the process, but hand holding the entire way through.
And Wendy, what made you decide to make the jump over to School First? And you just what school were you at the time? What some of the things you'd seen in terms of your career that made you want to say, hey, I think I want to do this?
Interesting. So I was at National Cathedral School. It's an all-girls school in Washington, D.C. Loved my 9 years there. It was pretty incredible. And coming from Oakland, California, I was surprised that I found this well-known, much more traditional school than I was used to. So amazing. I just fell in love with it. But a lot of it was they brought me in because the board asked to get somebody who would assertively help the school become more diverse. And that is what I had been doing in my schools, is trying to change culture by changing the demographics of the schools, which I love doing. After my 9 years, I saw the difference go from 37% kids of color to 48, 49%, which shifts the feel on campus. And then I kept listening to the conversations, and this is not NCS, this is all of our independent schools. The conversations were happening that were very similar to conversations after 30 years that we were having back in the Bay Area. People, why do they keep touching my hair? Why am I not in the AP classes? Why? And that was frustrating to me. I thought, what have I done? I've spent 30 years in these communities trying to impact change. And yes, they look different, but are they different? And I wasn't sure. And I felt like maybe I need to move out of the way. Maybe other people who have different experience and different backgrounds and different education can come in and affect bigger change. I brought people in, now what? And I felt like maybe I used my skills to the best of my ability. I'm going to go try something different. And that's when I connected with Linda and said, what do you want to do? So in addition to helping families find the right schools, we also help schools audit and look at what they're doing, either in the admissions process or as well as the inclusivity process. And we want to make sure that when we're sending kids to that school, they're going to be seen. I don't care if that means because they're neurodiverse or because they're low income or because they're African American or because they're mixed or whatever it is. Right. I am not going to send a kid somewhere unless I feel really confident that people are going to love on that kid and bring out the best in that child.
So let's unpack that a little bit in terms of you. Sounds like both of you recognize and have seen opportunities with independent schools and private, and the solve was integrating the schools more. And as you've worked with multiple schools in different places and regions, what's the difference between integrating and actually changing the environment for schools?
Huge difference. And I'll piggyback off what Wendy said, is because I would do a lot of what I thought was change and work through the lens of admission. I have events for families of color who were applying so that they could see how included they'd be in the community, for LGBTQIA families, so they could see that. And you can put them in, just like Wendy said, the numbers are growing, but we're not changing. So they still feel like they're not included. This is still not an inclusive community. And I started this work at Cathedral School, creating affinity groups 25 years ago.
Where's
Cathedral School in New York City, St. John the Divine. And we were so innovative with these affinity groups, so we could create space for kids to get together and talk amongst themselves who had things in common, whether it was race, adopted families, everything. And we're still there's still pushback, and it's not always vocal, but it feels.
From who though?
Administration, parents, other parents, teachers.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so then COVID happens.
Yes.
What role did COVID play in terms of helping or accelerating change, or did schools actually change?
Go
I
ahead.
mean,
I don't feel like.
sorry. Well, I was a lead administrator in schools during Black Lives Matter movement, and any named school that was pretty well known ended up having an account about them called Black at. And there are some schools that were founded on integration and founded on bringing these families together. And administrators were hearing some really hard things that span from 1966 to 2020. And when Black Lives Matter, these accounts started coming out. And I think people are saying, oh, wait, but we're so different now. And yet kids that are in the schools in 2020 were saying, I'm saying this. And then another alum would say, that's exactly how I felt.
Mm.
And that's hard to hear as administrator, because it's not the pushback for us nice, polite white people that we think we are, right? I mean, there's a lot of white educators, who really have the intention of making change and making it really good for everybody.
Change or integration?
We think it's change because we've changed. We are like, oh, look at how diverse our school is. And I like all these people. It's well intended. It doesn't impact the change. Right. And that is where it gets really hard. How, I was a lead administrator and with lead administrators of color, and we're all like, why haven't we been able to impact the change that we really got into this work for? Why is it's different, but not as different, and is not as inclusive. It's not everyone, it's equal. It's not equitable in some ways. Oftentimes it's not even equal, but in our best case scenario, it's equal as we can possibly be. But are we really equitable? Are we really serving every single individual in the way that will bring out that best in them? I don't think so.
And all the money we've thrown at doing this diversity work in schools. And I have, like, every year when I'm listening to these girls who are in private school crying about their experience because they don't feel included. And literally 30 years ago, diversity wasn't even a word that was used to describe people when I was in private school. But I could share stories with them. 30 years later, we have the same stories, and all we think we've done a lot of work, just growing numbers, but they just have another person to talk to who's in their same boat.
And so with the recent Supreme Court decision at the college level, with primarily, the Ivy schools, in terms of race-based outcomes not being a thing legally, from an admission standpoint, how does this play into your world? And I think we all know eventually it'll get down to K through 12. What are your observations? Is there a point of view in terms of how that decision impacts what we already know wasn't really changing, but it was actually integrating? So now with that decision, how difficult does it make it for families as well as the institutions?
I think that, I'll start here. When I communicate with schools about a child that I want to see if they have space for, or what are the possibilities of their getting in. Nowadays, I really get the question of, like, tell me a little bit about this family. So I'm free to talk about the family in every way. He's a child of color, he's Black, or he's Asian, or he has two moms or two dads, and I can do that. I know that the affirmative action is, strictly about race. I wonder how those conversations are going to go. I mean, I think they're
conversations between whom?
From me and the directors of admission at the schools, who are able to speak freely about race, because they are still in the same space that Wendy and I were in our schools over the years, of saying, okay, well, we don't have, we need to grow our numbers in terms of kids of color and diverse families and what all that means, gender, socioeconomic. So I don't know. I think that it hasn't happened yet, but it's happening. And I said that when I wrote our statement about the affirmative action, is that we've always been sort of held accountable by higher ed and independent schools. It's them creating diversity and writing papers about how kids cannot learn in an echo chamber. All that trickled down to independent schools. So I am curious to find out what that looks like for us moving forward. We're just embarking on a journey that is nerve-wracking in some ways.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
Wendy, what are you seeing in terms of your observations as well?
Well, I was living in Oakland when UC Berkeley, or the UCs, had to let go of race-based admission. And what I have tried to do in learning through that process and seeing the incredible impact it had on what used to be the most diverse public school in our country. And it is one of the least diverse now. I think it's something like 2%.
UC Berkeley, yeah.
UC Berkeley. And I watched it. I was next to it. I saw it. And it feels different as a community as you go on campus. And so in my 20 years since then, around 20 years, I tried to work with boards, tried to work with schools to talk about, you can be diverse and not change standards. And there's something about our history, not something that sounds like it's mysterious, but our history has made it seem like if you have kids of color, Black kids, Latino kids, some mixed kids, then you're lowering your standards. And it's just so not true. There's a bigger picture. And if you are educating boards as to what the full picture looks like, then you know that you can have an inclusive community with all kids who are bringing so much to the table. But if we keep admissions with one or two check boxes of what kids have to jump through to get in, then we're keeping the same kids going to private schools. Right. Because the private schools were meant for a certain population, right? And we haven't really changed. COVID's helped us change some of the admissions process, just because it had to, not for philosophical reasons, but we had to for ease, availability. But there's a lot we can look at to see how do we keep building an inclusive, or begin building a more inclusive community. Yeah. But it's going to take some creativity and really hard work and some serious look at who we are. So as an independent school.
So in that sense, I mean, now more than ever, these institutions, as well as families, they're actually going to really have to change. And in your observation, we'll talk a little bit about the partnership that we've formed. A lot of times the barriers are within how they're structured, lack of strategy, or supplementing strategy, or creating a strategy. The systems that they have in place, partners meaning solutions, and really just understanding families, diverse families, of who they are and their needs. Can you guys speak to that a little bit in terms of the barriers that the institutions have had historically, this decision, and what do they now need to do to change so that they do reflect, I like to call it the new majority, the future of schools, the future of how we now create an environment that reflects the way that the world will look over the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years.
Yeah. Well, that's one of the reasons I'm so excited about our partnership with Reframe, because I feel like, just speaking to George Floyd, and I want to get back to the strategy piece, but I feel like we're having the conversation just more and louder. It's more and louder. I don't think that it's any different. conversation hasn't changed. It's just gotten to be one that we need to have, and you have more often. We need to form this committee and that committee and meet in the evenings and have a potluck. And so it is lack of strategy. I always say, and I've said this to every single head of school I've ever worked for, these teachers are afraid. They're afraid to speak. They don't want to misspeak. This country has created a system where we're afraid to have real dialogue. And so in that, we're stuck. And so that's where the systems piece comes in. The systems have to change. Otherwise, we're just going to get even louder, and change is not going to happen. It's like we need to almost break it down to build it back up. And a lot of that work is work we need to do within ourselves, but really the institution, because it's not the individuals, it's the system.
Mm-hmm.
And may I add, I was just thinking two things, right? I think the reason a lot of change hasn't happened is because what I started with is that these schools were founded on exclusivity. And those are hard things to change on your foundations, not just, yeah. And I think people are very afraid that if we're talking diversity, we're not talking about every kid. We're talking about a population. We're not talking about every single student in the school.
That's right.
And that gets really nerve-wracking, particularly to board members who typically represent those kids that we apparently aren't talking about when we're talking about diversity, right? So to be blunt, the white kids. Okay, so if we're talking about diversity, so we're not talking about what our white kids, but I'm paying $50,000 maybe for my kid too. Where is my kid fitting in on this? Does that mean some kids benefit and some kids have to lose because we're doing this work? Mm-hmm. If we're doing this work well, it should be that every single kid we're working in a way that every single kid benefits. And the second thing I would say is some people might watch this and say, oh, there are those woke folks again.
Here we go.
Can't stand that word.
Yeah.
But right. And here we go again. And what does this mean? If you care about your school, sustainability wise, if you look at statistics, just what you were referring to, Jeffrey, that across the country, over 50% of the applicants in private school are families of color. And so that's just talking about families of color. We're not talking about LGBTQ families. We're not talking about adopted kids. We're not talking about all the other diversity that we want to talk about. But that is just, if you want to be a sustainable private school, you can't be exclusive. Mm-mm. Towards people of color, your school will close because the applications, because of the population change that is just happening in our country, as much as some may want to fight that is just fact. Statistically evidenced, supported. And so how do we change that every kid should be included? Look, I don't want one 6-year-old boy not included just because he's wealthy and white, but I also want to make sure that every single kid is looked at and seen, and see how that every individual kid is brought into the community in a really thoughtful, intellectual way.
And can I just say one more thing? I'm speaking to boards, because the boards are so powerful in independent schools, and we sleep on that because you think about the head of school, right? And that's what you would think of as if you go to public school, you'll think of the principal, but then you have to think about the superintendent and then the school board. The board at an independent school has loud voices and so the work that I hope to do with Reframe is to bring the board in with the administration. That work, they have to also be a part of that change.
Conversation, yeah. So, news alert for those who didn't catch it. Reframe is partnering with School First, and for some of those who haven't seen the press release that it's gone out. When we started this podcast, we didn't want to make this like an advertising platform, but more of talk to what we call people leaders who are making an impact by accelerating inclusive change and growth. And so we wanted to use, this episode to highlight what we call an emerging industry vertical, meaning that when you look at a lot of our experiences, they've been big corporate brands and businesses. But we always pride ourselves is that we didn't want to like create this company just to, do another version of D&I. We wanted to be innovative, we wanted to productize our change operating system, and then expanded into other industries and categories, not by ourselves, but through partners, or what we call channel partnerships. And so when the Supreme Court decision happened, we knew we had something special. We just needed a partner to help us land and navigate it to make impact the same way that we've made impact with large, big brands. And so when we got together with School First, what was really impressive is like how Wendy and Linda came together to help solve a decades-old problem in terms of admissions and helping families navigate it, as you just heard. And now with this partnership, the goal would be like, in the corporate side, would say, how do you take it upstream? And upstream is like the board, the admissions, as well as heads of schools. And so, I firmly believe a lot of the things that we've developed is scalable and it's applicable across other industries. But what we want to do with this partnership is partner to land in a space as a parent of two kids from independent schools, private schools. There's always been the issue, but now there's a solve for it, and that's what we like to use the last 10 minutes to talk a little bit about in terms of my experience with independent and private schools. Is that just like corporate, they think they're doing the right thing by doing the integration piece, but they really haven't had a full-on blonde transformation conversation in terms of change. So the first thing that we're going to do collaboratively is introduce the Reframe Culture Maturity Assessment tool. And so as we spent, months, trying to make sure that we were using the right language to introduce this, can you both talk a little bit about in terms of, how now having that assessment tool can be impactful for independent and private schools to understand the level of change readiness? Can you guys speak to that?
Well, I want to go, if I could, a little bit beyond the assessment tool, because I think the assessment tool is key for our conversation to begin. But in independent schools, we've had several assessment tools over the years, right? I know everybody knows AIM, and there's a few others. I can't think of the name of them right now.
For the people that are not familiar with it, what is it?
So AIM is a tool that you use to sort of assess your, it is based on DEI work. It is about like, how inclusive are you being? What are your numbers like? About your curriculum. It's like a full overhaul and like how you need to change, sort of like when you have to do accreditation each year. It's like a diversity accreditation where people come in and look around and see what you're doing right and what you need to work on. But I feel like very much the difference of Reframe is that I've been at schools where that AIM assessment goes on the shelf or not. It's kind of up to the school because it's too much. It's a lot of work. It's like and then it's also, I don't know that the right people are in on the conversation. I think some people are being left out of the conversation, so that it's easy to sort of set that thing aside because you know what, we have to get the math done. We have to, we have a new green space that we're working on right now, right? So that the difference I think is beyond. I love the mini assessment with Reframe, but I also love the idea of Reframe coming in and partnering with the schools to support the work. Because like I said with the last question, is that it's fair and we don't know what to do. Schools don't know what to do. It's frightening.
Gotcha. And Wendy, what's your perspective in terms of starting with the understanding level of change readiness? What's your vision for, the impact that you wanted to make?
Yeah, well, I was excited to learn what Reframe does, Jeffrey. Thank you because you do come in with assessment, but it's different. It's a different kind of assessment, and the mini one is very accessible, and I think it's super important for schools just to get a sense of Where are they? But through a lens of someone different. Not, we're a little bit of, everybody's been in education or independent schools. 90% of us has pretty much only been in independent schools.
Right.
And what an impact, what a difference it makes when we just change schools. I mean, I've gone to schools and suddenly people are like, "You're brilliant." I'm like, "No, I'm not. I'm just copying whatever everybody was doing over there."
Right.
Thanks, I'll take it, except I'm not that brilliant.
That
We
is so
keep
true.
doing best practices. There's nothing wrong with the best practices. These schools are phenomenal. Best practices at what? We haven't found a best practice of real change for equity and inclusivity because our country is far from figuring that out. But what I like about Reframe is you've been working with a wide breadth of kinds of organizations and impacting change. So yeah, if somebody looks on your website and they're like, "You've been working with," I'm making something up. Give me a company that everybody would know, Jeffrey. I don't want to make one up.
Oh, please. Verizon, Wyndham, Prudential, United.
There you go. See, right? I mean, school heads, we would, if I just brought that and showed them that, look at what they've done, they're like, "What? That has nothing to do with us.
Yeah, we're not connected
That's
to that.
not going to help us."
Yeah.
Hence why we need a partner.
Right. Except that you're making change in a way bigger organization that has a way more hierarchical system.
Yeah.
And it's impacting change. And then you move over into the arts world. Has nothing to do with our world. I mean,
kind of, sort of.
Forgive me. I don't mean that. We have tons of art happening in our schools and it's fabulous. But the way our organizations run are very different from independent schools.
Right.
With that said, you are proving to impact the change. And to be honest, I'm like, just give me change. Let's try something different. Let's not hire other people who've been working in independent schools for 20 years to help us keep moving forward. Because if that is what it meant to be an expert, I would be the best Linda and I would be the experts. And we left the schools because we felt like we were not the experts.
Right.
We don't have the answers we believe schools need. And yet we still really want to help impact the change. Right. So that's why we're trying to reach across and say, "Jeffrey, give us something unique. You're using technology. You're using very different change results that I think is worth us taking a very good look at and deepening our cultures."
No, we're really excited about the partnership and the opportunity. I think the macro pieces are applicable, whether it's education, public and private, brands and businesses that, demographic shift is happening, future of work in some cases, the what we call industry correction. You think about Supreme Court decision, that's an industry correction in terms of how not only just it's trickling down to corporations in terms of how they procure goods and services from minority-owned suppliers. So these are things that are not going away. And like I said, we're excited to enter this, what we call our corporate talk, this industry vertical in terms of private education. And so with the last few minutes that we do have, if you are someone, it's a parent who is a part of a private and independent school community, if you are an administrator for private and independent school, if you are an admissions professional, where do they start with School First? Meaning, where do they go to get in contact with you? How, if they want to learn more about the mini assessment, where should they go?
Wendy, you want to take this?
Sure, I believe. I mean, the easiest is
School
go
First.
to School First, schoolfirstnyc.com. And it's NYC because it was founded by Linda in New York. And we have expanded across the globe. But we will work with schools anywhere who are ready. Just because you're making a statement that you're really, really wanting to make some real changes. We also know that after COVID, schools are exhausted. Educators are exhausted. We're not saying we're going to add on 800 new things that you have to do now on top of what you're doing. it's really assessing and looking at how we can make the best practices happen for every single student
More precise
on your campus, right?
Yeah.
And so if you are wanting to find out more, just take the mini assessment.
Yeah,
it's
that's
free.
the easy part. Yeah. And it's fast.
See where your school is, because I tell you, a couple schools ago, I would have been like, we've got this. We're in the Bay Area. We know this.
Right. Same New York City too. So progressive.
Mm-hmm. Right? We got this. And then you look at it, you're like, oh, we got things to learn. Right. And that's okay. I hope we all want to learn. We're in education. But so go to our website under schools. You will see a link to the mini assessment through the School First and Reframe working together to really help schools change.
Beautiful, beautiful. And Linda, is there anything else you want to add before we close out here?
I would just add that you and I talk about New York City and places where we worked, and we both have the Bay Area, you have DC, LA, everywhere. But I feel like, we go to enough conferences where we talk to enough people from the Midwest, the South, right? Everywhere. The boarding schools that are in New England. Mm-hmm. And we're having the same conversations with everyone, no matter where you are. So we all recognize that we need change. That's a common thread of a conversation for the past 30 plus years that you and I have worked in schools.
Well,
yeah.
Before we sign off, I'd like to say, I think it was really important for the listeners and audience members that are not as familiar with how independent and private schools form, and then listening to your journeys as you guys have now spent 20 plus years. And, the question begins to say, have given all the work that's been done, your observations, has anything really changed? And you jumped out, and Linda, you started School First. Wendy came along. You guys are, doing a lot of great work with admissions. Now moving into this new space of adding services to your current offering as it relates to change, as it relates to change management, is really admirable. These are the types of conversations that we want to have on the Change podcast by Reframe. So we really appreciate your time, effort, and look forward to working with you in the future.
Yay, thank you.
Can't wait.
I'm excited too.
Thank you. Thanks, Jeffrey.